All right.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's program, A History of Immigration in the U.S., and particularly immigration law. I am happy to have with us today Fred Sau, the Senior Policy Counsel from the Illinois Coalition for Immigration and Refugee Rights. My name is Mari Carmen Cifuentes. I'm an Adult Services Associate here at the library and also assist with providing immigration services. So if you would like more information, please contact us. Our information, you can see our phone number is on our slide. This program is brought to you today from the Neighbors Together series programs that we are having, together with 6 libraries, and we are supporting Literacy DuPage's efforts and the work that they do providing English language tutoring and other services to our community. We are hoping to foster more learning and understanding between neighbors and to understand more about the different experiences of immigrants in the United States. Before we continue, the captions are on. If you need them, you can turn those off if you don't need those. And if you have any questions, we're going to hold off for those at the end. So if you could just go ahead and put them in the chat box, we'll get to those questions at the end. I did want to highlight a couple of upcoming programs from the Neighbors Together series. On this Saturday, February 12th, we're going to have a Writing Your Story, a memoir and creative nonfiction workshop held in person at the Indian Prairie Library. On Monday night, February 14th at 7 p.m. online, we'll have a College of DuPage panel discussion of Laila Lami's book, Conditional Citizens. And then on Wednesday, February 16th at 7 here at the Addison Public Library, we will have a book discussion of Cristina Enriquez's The Book of Unknown Americans. We do have more programming for the Neighbors Together series this month of February, so please check out the ippl.info website or our addisonlibrary.org page for more details. And a thank you to all our partners, to Literacy DuPage, the Indian Prairie Public Library, Naperville Public Library, Westmont Public Library, Wheaton Public Library, and Itasca Public Library. And now I'd like to welcome Fred Sau. Fred Sau is the Senior Policy Counsel at the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights. In this capacity, he provides technical support, trainings, and presentations on immigration-related topics to service providers, the immigrant community, organizations, and others. He also provides updates and analysis of changes in immigration policy and procedures to members and allies of ICER. A self-described recovering attorney, Fred practiced law at the Rockford office of Prairie State Legal Services, where he worked after receiving his law degree from the University of Michigan. He has also worked with the American Civil Liberties Union of Illinois, the Chicago Anti-Hunger Federation, and the Missouri Public Interest Research Group. A native of Chicago, Fred is a son of immigrants from China and has had a lifelong concern with immigration issues. So, Fred, welcome.
Thank you, Mary Carmen. And it's good to be with everyone this evening. Thank you for tuning in and spending a part of your Thursday evening with this program. I hope it's going to be informative and thought-provoking. Bit about my organization for those of you who are not familiar with it. The Illinois Coalition for Immigrants and Refugee Rights is the state's largest multi-ethnic immigrant advocacy organization. We have about 100 organizations under our umbrella. This includes social service agencies, ethnic associations, educational institutions, faith congregations, labor unions, trade associations, you name it, we probably have some under our umbrella, and also reflecting the vast diversity of immigrants communities throughout our state. So as Mari Carmen said, I am the Senior Policy Counsel, so I get involved in much of the educational work as well as the policy development and advocacy work for ICRRR. So I am going to be speaking for the better part of the next hour, reviewing the history of immigration to the United States. So I'm going to try to be packing about 400 years of history into a very short amount of time. I am going to be going at a somewhat rapid clip. I hope to provide time for time to respond to questions toward the end. Again, I hope this is going to be informative and thought-provoking. So, I want to start off by just reviewing a really basic question: why do people cross international borders? Why would someone, pick up and leave their home, the home in which it could be the only home they've known. It could be a home that they've been living in for many, many years. If they could have their family there, they could have friends there and just move someplace else where they might not speak the language, they might not know anyone, they might not even be able to make a living, and for that matter, they might not even be welcome in this new place. Well, I basically summarize this into three four-letter words: work, love, and fear. Many people obviously move to a different location, a different home, a different country in order to pursue economic opportunities, in order to pursue a job, in order to, pursue education to better enable them to work, and to advance their careers. Other people might want to move to rejoin family members who are already in the destination country, or they may have someone they really care for or really love, and they might want to be with that person, even if it means leaving their home and venturing into their beloved's new country. Or they might be facing conditions in their home country that are really dangerous, whether it's war or famine or gang violence or political repression. They might need to leave their home country in order to seek protection, and whether it's through asylum or a refugee process, that's or some other kind of humanitarian provision. So those are the three main ways: work, love, and fear. Second baseline question: why do people go where they go? So sometimes it could be for really personal reasons, but in large part, though, people have this impression that people move to, larger groups of people moved from one country to another, just for economic reasons. You have a poor country next to a rich country, and people are just going to be drawn to the rich country. That is often the case, but it's not always the case. International migration generally involves some connection between the country where people are leaving and the country where people are trying to get to. And usually those relationships, those connections involve historical ties. Very often they're colonial ties between one country and another. Very, very often these ties have to do with economic recruitment. Very often the receiving country will be actively seeking out people from the sending country to settle in the receiving country. Remember that, because that theme is going to come up fairly repeatedly during my talk. So, with respect to the Western Hemisphere and the area that's now the United States, one thing to remember is that humans are not a native species to the Western Hemisphere. The human race emerged out of Africa and then dispersed to the rest of the globe. About 15,000 years ago, humans crossed the Bering Strait, during the Ice Age, and dispersed throughout the Western Hemisphere. The descendants of those ancestors are now the indigenous peoples, the Native Americans, First Nations in Canada, other indigenous peoples. What we usually think of, though, when we think of immigration is the immigration that started happening after the European discovery of the Western Hemisphere. And specifically, in the case of the United States, the British colonies along the eastern seaboard that began just over 400 years ago. Many individuals came to the English colonies for work. Some came for religious freedom. Some came to establish just their own communities. Again, whether on religious purposes or for other reasons. It is important to note that there were hundreds of thousands of individuals from Africa who were captured and brought to the Western Hemisphere in bondage as enslaved laborers. So we do not want to lose sight of that population from the African diaspora. Now, you may think that settlement in the British colonies was fairly open, and it was for the most part. But that, of course, didn't mean that there wasn't anti-immigrant sentiment, as early as the colonial period. So I'm going to read a quote from one of our founding fathers that kind of illustrates this sentiment. "Why should these Boers be suffered to swarm into our settlements and by herding together establish their language and manners to the exclusion of others? Why should our state, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens who will shortly be so numerous as to change us instead of us anglifying them, and will never adopt our language and customs any more than they can acquire our complexion?" The year in which this person said this was 1751. The speaker was Benjamin Franklin, and he was talking about Pennsylvania and the German immigrants who were moving into Pennsylvania around that time. I like to pull out this quote because it illustrates many of the same tropes that we see over and over and over again, reflecting negative attitudes of immigrants, that they're a swarm, that they're never going to learn the language or customs of the land where they're settling, that they're taking over, that they're going to change the people who are already there, and that they will never acculturate, they will never assimilate. So again, keep this sentiment in mind as well. Despite such sentiments, the United States really did not restrict immigration by nationality or really any other criteria for most of its early history. For the first 100 years of this country's history, immigration was largely left up to the states, particularly those states on the East Coast, which regulated immigration by how much they would charge ships per passenger, and that was it. Otherwise, things were fairly wide open. Now, again, that didn't mean that there wasn't anti-immigrant sentiment in the early years of our country. Around just before the Civil War, there was an outbreak of anti-Catholic sentiment among many people who were already living in the United States, which was at that time a largely Protestant country. This anti-Catholic sentiment targeted the newer waves of immigrants who were arriving around that time, namely the Irish and German Catholic immigrants. This this sentiment led to the formation of a political party, the American Party, which actually elected a mayor of Chicago back in 1855. That mayor tried to crack down on you know on on liquor licensing, and which led to a revolt among the German and Irish immigrants in Chicago, who organized to unseat that mayor in the next election in the next year. A very early example of immigrant organizing. I should also note here that throughout the first century or so of American history, of U.S. history, that is, many of these newly arriving immigrants were able to become citizens. One of the very first laws passed by the new U.S. Congress in 1790 was the Naturalization Act. Now, the Naturalization Act did provide for a process through which people who were immigrants could become naturalized citizens, but only for white immigrants. This actually led to, this provision actually led to a number of lawsuits, particularly in the, later in the 19th century, as to who counted as white. So did an Arab immigrant who came from Syria count as white? Did someone from India count as white? So this limitation on naturalization did not actually end until 1952, and thereby excluding many non-white immigrants from being able to naturalize. Also during this time, African Americans had a really unresolved, unsettled status, whether they were still enslaved or whether they were able to gain their freedom. The Supreme Court issued a decision in 1857, the Dred Scott decision, that essentially said that no Americans of African descent could ever become U.S. citizens. This was, this court decision was one of the precipitating factors of the U.S. Civil War, and led ultimately to the 14th Amendment, which was enacted right after the Civil War, which provided that nearly all people born in the United States were in fact U.S. citizens, with a couple of exceptions. Native Americans were not considered U.S. citizens. Instead, they were considered, they were considered essentially members of a foreign nation. They did not get U.S. citizenship until 1924. And then another exception that still applies is children of diplomats, and they do not count because they are beyond the reach of U.S. law. As are their diplomat parents. So, fast forward to the 1880s, and the first major restrictions on immigration, that were enacted nationwide. This was targeting the first major nationality that came freely to the United States from someplace other than Europe. You're looking at them, the Chinese. The Chinese started coming to the West Coast, specifically to California, during the Gold Rush. They later started coming to the American West, very often specifically recruited to work to build the railroads, to work on mines, to work on farms, and they became so numerous that many of the white settlers in these areas started feeling threatened, and they issued portrayals of these Chinese immigrants as dangerous people, as criminals, as drug addicts, as degenerates, and they ultimately succeeded in getting Congress to pass the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. Now, I should note here that Chinese immigrants found ways to get around these laws, most famously by creating fake birth certificates, claiming to be children of U.S. citizens, and therefore the U.S. citizens themselves. I point this out because this is the way my own father came to the United States. He claimed to be a U.S. citizen by virtue of a U.S. citizen father. And was able to immigrate that way. He did eventually, you know, rectify his status and become a U.S. citizen. But he came the way that several generations of other Chinese men came to the United States, evading the Chinese Exclusion Act. In subsequent years, Congress saw fit to enact further restrictions on immigration from Asia, first applying to the Japanese and then to other areas within Asia, ultimately passing the Asian Exclusion Act in 1917. There's one major exception to the overall bar on Asian immigration. That was Filipinos. Keep in mind that the Philippines became U.S. territory during the Spanish-American War, and so many businesses, farms, other industries on the West Coast were able to specifically bring in Filipino laborers, where previously they would have brought in Chinese or Japanese laborers. And this included most famously some of the agricultural workers in California who worked with Cesar Chavez to organize the United Farm Workers. Now, around the same time that these restrictions were happening against Asians, the United States was also seeing a large influx of Eastern and Southern European immigrants. This is the era that generally gets associated with Ellis Island in New York Harbor. So many of these immigrants were attracted by advertising, or were specifically recruited to settle, buy and settle on farms, in the Midwest, or they were brought in to work in various industries. Most famously meatpacking and textile and garment work. It's a couple of things to note here. First off, people kind of romanticize Ellis Island as the great gateway to the United States, but it's important to note that Ellis Island was also a screening facility. And quite a number of people were held at Ellis Island, and a significant numbers of people were turned away from Ellis Island and sent back on the next boat for whatever reasons. U.S. lawmakers enacted several additional laws to restrict how what kinds of people would be let into Ellis, through Ellis Island or other ports of entry. There were screens regarding criminal history, public health, good moral character, and other and other kinds of measures. Now, around the same time, in cities like Chicago and elsewhere, you saw the growth of the settlement house movement. Most famously, Hull House, founded by Jane Addams, that worked with newly arrived immigrants to teach them English, to teach them, U.S. history and culture, to teach them job skills and find them work. That said, though, there was also a strand of opinion that really did not look upon these new immigrants with favor, and ultimately, that sentiment won out right after World War I, where you saw enactment of quota laws, culminating in 1924 with really harsh quotas that effectively shut down immigration from much of Eastern and Southern Europe. So for several decades, throughout the mid 20th century, immigration from Europe was very much restricted. So I've talked so far about Asia, and Europe. One big area that I have not spoken about is the rest of the Western Hemisphere, Latin America, and specifically Mexico. The United States and Mexico have had a long and somewhat torturous history when it comes to immigration. First off, to note is that the first Mexicans, to become citizens of the United States did not actually arrive in the United States in the traditional way. Instead, they came to live in the United States because the U.S. expanded its borders. This was as a result of the U.S.-Mexican War that ended in 1848, with the U.S. acquiring Texas, California, Arizona, New Mexico, and several other Western states. Migration from what we now know as Mexico, with the borders along the Rio Grande and south of Arizona and New Mexico and California, really began in earnest in the early 20th century. This again, typical pattern. There was a lot of recruitment of Mexican laborers to work in agriculture, to work in heavy industry. Also, at the same time, the Mexican Revolution was happening, and many people were fleeing Mexico, seeking safety and seeking refuge in the United States. Now, this earlier migration from Mexico had a feature that's known as circularity. That is, people would come up from Mexico to the United States. They would work. They would send money home. And then after a while, whether it's an agricultural season, or a few years or so, they would go back. So they would make a giant circle, and quite a number of Mexican workers, ran this circuit over and over again. So that's what's known as circularity. Another thing to note here is that Mexican migration was, for the most part, unrestricted, at least when it comes to numbers. There were no quotas that were imposed on Mexican immigrants, unlike the quotas that applied to Europe. However, there were other ways other immigration restrictions that applied to Mexico. Public charge, that is the concern as to whether an immigrant would come to rely on public support for their subsistence. That was a common restriction. Another common restriction was public health, to the point where very oftentimes Mexican workers needed to produce certificates that they had bathed sometime in the preceding 2 weeks. So those were the kinds of restrictions that applied to Mexico. I said that there was kind of a long and tortured history, and I say this because the United States has kind of gone back and forth as to whether to try to bring in Mexican immigrants or whether to try to drive them out. So, and the mid 20th century, illustrates this. So, during the 1910s, 1920s, particularly after World War I, the U.S. economy was booming, and there was a lot of demand for labor, and so many businesses in the West tried to bring in Mexican workers, to work ranches and farms and such. Fast forward to 1929 and the early 1930s, you have the Great Depression. Many U.S. workers are out of work, and Mexican workers were perceived as competing with U.S. workers, so that led to a massive expulsion program, from the United States. That's essential. That led to not only the immigrants themselves, but also many of their U.S. citizen family members and children also being expelled. Fast forward another 10 years to 1942. World War II is happening. Many people in the United States are enlisting in the military. Many are also working in defense industries. That left a huge shortage of people who were available to work the farms and to work the mines and such. So the U.S. government worked out an arrangement with Mexico to start the Bracero program. That again specifically recruited Mexican workers to fill economic needs on the part of U.S. business interests. Fast forward another 10 years, and you get to the 1950s. Now, I should have pointed out that the Bracero program again began in 1942. Even after World War II, many farmers and many farms and other businesses became really reliant upon Mexican workers, whether brought in by the Bracero program or arriving through other means, including just crossing the border. The Bracero program, by the way, did not end until 1964. 19 years after the end of World War II. But come the 1950s, you had all this concern about, the workers who were coming in outside the Bracero program. So that became the impetus for what was, what then became known as Operation Wetback, another mass expulsion program of Mexican laborers, many of whom were then able to get Bracero visas to come right back to the United States, and in many cases, right back to the farm or work site where they had been working. So so again, you see this back and forth between the United States and Mexico. So this brings us up to 1965. 1965 was kind of a momentous year in immigration history. And for context, I should note that a number of things were going on. Obviously, this was during the Civil Rights Movement era. So there was a lot of concern about discrimination and racism in many of our laws and legal structures. Also, this was a good while after World War II. World War II unfortunately revealed many of the problems with the quota system that was imposed back in 1924, specifically having to do with refugees who were fleeing Europe, including Jewish refugees who were blocked from settling in the United States by these quotas. So in 1965, Congress passed and President Johnson signed a major overhaul of the immigration laws. So instead of this quota system, instead what that was applied country by country or to entire geographic areas, instead that was replaced by a new system that was focused on family relationships and employment relationships. Again, getting back to those 3 4-letter words that I began my presentation work: love, work, and fear. Now, the fear part was finally written into the laws formally in 1980 with the Refugee Act. But even under even with the 1965 overhaul, there were certain considerations given to for humanitarian grounds of migration. So everything should have been okay up to that point, right? Well, I have two more pages of notes, so that gives you an indication that we're not quite done yet. It soon became apparent that this new system, as grounded as it was in the real basic motivations why people move, was unfortunately not quite adequate. The family systems and the employer systems began to face huge backlogs. And I should note here, employment visas were limited to 140,000 per year, and they were skewed toward really high levels of education and professional standing. So even people who are considered skilled workers, that is, workers who have some level of training, or who are seeking, coming to fill jobs involving some level of training. Generally, those visas are backlogged about 5 years. And if that applies to skilled workers, you can only imagine what kind of consideration unskilled workers would receive. Similarly, the family system also, became backlogged. Now, only certain kinds of relationships count for family sponsorship purposes, and while some relationships were not numerically limited, like spouses and minor children and parents, certain other relationships, like trying to sponsor an adult son or daughter or a sibling, those categories were numerically limited, and those categories also faced major backlogs. The most extreme example is siblings. So it's very common for for U.S. citizens who are sponsoring a brother or sister to immigrate to the United States, for that sibling to be waiting as long as 22 years, within the legal immigration system. So, this is, for all those people who are fortunate to qualify under this system, for whom there is a line to get into. But unfortunately, for many people, there is no line to get into. So when people say, well, why don't one of these folks get in line? In many cases, there is no line to get into, or the line is very long. So the impact of the 65 law hit Mexico particularly hard, coming back to Mexico. So for the first time, there was a kind of a hemispheric cap on migration from Mexico, which made a largely legal, unrestricted flow of Mexican migrants illegal overnight. So it's calculated that between 1965 and 1985, 26.7 million undocumented Mexicans came to the United States. Of that, about 22 million eventually left the United States. Again, the circularity pattern. Okay, but that still left about 4.9, million Mexican migrants who settled in the United States. Some of them were able to qualify for green cards based on a family sponsorship or even an employment sponsorship, but many were not able to. So by 1982, there was a fairly large undocumented population in the United States. So I'm going to read another quote, which may be a little bit surprising, but here it goes. Quote, "We must also recognize that both the U.S. and Mexico have historically benefited from Mexicans obtaining employment in the U.S. A number of our states have special labor needs, and we should take these into account. Illegal immigrants in considerable numbers have become productive members of our society and are a basic part of our workforce. Those who have established equities in the U.S. should be recognized and accorded legal status." The speaker here is President Ronald Reagan, and he said this in 1981. And in fact, when he ran for president in 1980, he ran expressly on a platform that called for a legalization or amnesty program. Reagan followed through on that campaign pledge in 1986 with the approval of the Immigration Reform and Control Act, or IRCA. Now, IRCA legalized 2.7 million undocumented workers. It basically accounted for most of the undocumented population in the United States. Now, I know that there are some people who would argue that the lessons of the 1986 amnesty were that amnesty didn't work, and they point to the fact that the undocumented population is much larger than it was back then. I would argue instead, first off, IRCA did work for the people who benefited from it, many of whom, many of whom are now U.S. citizens, quite a number of whom are leaders in their community. I count at least one of my coworkers as one such person who benefited from IRCA, and quite a number of other people I know and work with. But where IRCA fell down is that it did not address the causes of migration. It failed to provide any additional legal channels for people to migrate, and most significantly, it failed to account for the ongoing need for immigrant labor. Instead, it went the other way. It made it, for the first time, it made it a crime for a business to hire and employ undocumented workers. Now, and many of you would have seen the legacy of this upon taking a new job. Your HR department would have asked you to provide an identity document and some proof that you're authorized to work, whether it's a Social Security card or a work permit or some other kind of documentation. That is one of the legacies of IRCA, and that did not exist until 1986. Now, this system of checking people's work authorization was enforced only half-heartedly. It proved very burdensome and very costly for a lot of businesses, and many businesses quite simply looked the other way. So, the draw of employment in the United States continued, and there was very often good reason for people to continue to try to come to the United States. Around this time in Central America, there were quite a number of countries were experiencing civil war and government repression, and so many people came up from Central America seeking asylum or seeking refuge. Mexico was also going through some growing pains when it came to its economy, and these growing pains were only exacerbated by NAFTA, which took effect in 1994. NAFTA facilitated the freer flow of products and capital, but unfortunately, it did not facilitate the movement of people. Instead, what ended up happening is that cheap U.S. grain flooded into Mexican markets and bankrupted many Mexican farmers, drove them off their land, and essentially compelled them to seek economic opportunities elsewhere, including north of the border. Now, while all this was happening, again, this is now the mid 1990s. The U.S. was moving in the other direction. It was cracking down on the border, through operations like Operation Gatekeeper in San Diego and Operation Hold the Line in El Paso. The strategy here was to try to amass border patrol resources in those larger cities that were the most common crossing points for migrants. This operation succeeded in some ways, but unfortunately, one of the major tragic side effects of this was driving migrants into more remote and more dangerous crossing areas, which led to a spike in deaths on the border, starting in the mid-90s and continuing to this day. We also saw new laws, including a new law that was passed in 1996, the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, which in many ways made it harder to get into the United States, made it harder to stay, and made it much easier to get deported. This was a very long bill that had a lot of provisions in it. Most famously, it disqualified many people who entered the United States without documents from getting lawful status. It imposed harsher standards on U.S. citizen family members who are trying to sponsor their relatives. It made asylum processing much more difficult, and it made it easier for low-level border officials to turn people away and reject their asylum claims. It also made more kinds of criminal offenses or convictions of criminal offenses, including relatively minor ones, into what are called aggravated felonies, for which there is no relief from deportation. Also, what was then the Immigration and Naturalization Service could also pull out old deportation orders and use them again to deport people who are trying to come back to the country without giving them a court date. Now, all of this, all of these measures, whether it's whether it's tougher border enforcement or tougher laws, made crossing the border difficult, and paradoxically led to a much larger undocumented population. And that circularity pattern that I was talking about earlier broke down. Instead, once people made it to the United States, they generally tended to stay instead of working for a while and then returning. So that led to a much larger undocumented population, which peaked out at about 12 million people around 2010. The undocumented population now, about more than 10 years later, is now down to about 11 million, and that's due in part to people just giving up and returning. It also, quite a number of people have somehow been able to gain lawful status, that said, the population is still about 11 million. About half of that population is from Mexico. Another 20% are from other Latin American countries. Now, when I say that the population peaked around 2010, it was around that time that net migration from Mexico flipped. It's now net zero. Why is that? It's because, in large part, the Mexican economy is doing better. Around that time, keep in mind that the United States and much of the world was experiencing an economic crisis, and we were deep in a recession that that took a while to recover from. So fewer people from Mexico thought that it was wise to come up to the United States to look for work. That said, though, more recently, within the last 10 years or so, we are seeing, unfortunately, continued unrest and violence in many Central American countries, and also migration from South American countries. Other countries that are largely represented among the undocumented population: India, China, Korea. Here in the Chicago area, we have large Polish and Irish undocumented populations. We're also seeing now, quite a number of African immigrants, settling in, quite a number of whom are undocumented. Now, obviously, these people, some of these people were able to, make it to elsewhere in the Western Hemisphere and cross over. However, quite a number of these people came on temporary visas. There's as students or temporary workers or visitors, and they overstayed their visas. About half of the people who count as undocumented became undocumented that way by overstaying their visas, authorizing them to come to the United States. About 2/3 of the undocumented have been here more than 10 years. So they've established roots in the community. And counting in that is everybody who has DACA right now. In fact, everybody who has DACA now will have been here at about 15 years. And so 89% of the undocumented who live in a family household in Illinois live with a legally present family member. 75% live with a U.S. citizen. Very often that's a child, but that can also include a spouse or some other family member. So the undocumented are our family members. And, again, many undocumented people live in mixed status families where various household members have different statuses. Now, there have been a number of attempts over the last 20 years or so to try to fix the situation with the undocumented. Back in 2001, there were hopes of a deal with Mexico, with the election of George W. Bush and, here in the United States, and Vicente Fox in Mexico. Those prospects, unfortunately, were dashed with the 9/11 attacks. And it took a while for immigration reform efforts to regain momentum after that. We saw some attempts in 2006 and 2007 to pass comprehensive immigration reform bills that tried to balance out a legalization program with tougher border measures. Those efforts ended up for naught. You also saw the emergence of the DREAM Act, which would benefit immigrants who came to the United States as children. This was first introduced in 2001. It's been reintroduced in every subsequent Congress since then. It still, unfortunately, has not become law. And after the failure of the DREAM Act in 2010, the Obama administration created the DACA program in 2012 that enabled many of those younger immigrants who came as children to at least get some kind of temporary protection and work authorization. That program, unfortunately, was struck down by a court a few months ago, but both those folks who have DACA are still able to enjoy protection under DACA. It's just that new people cannot qualify for it. And then most recently, not quite most recently, the most recent serious attempt to pass comprehensive immigration reform legislation was in 2013. At that time, a bill passed the U.S. Senate, but unfortunately did not get considered in the U.S. House. All the while, though, we also saw a major surge in immigration enforcement activity, both under presidents of both parties, under President Bush and President Obama. We saw record spending on enforcement and record levels of deportation. So the old INS, in the wake of the 9/11 attacks, got dismantled, and the pieces of it were reintegrated into the Department of Homeland Security. And so border functions were turned over to Customs and Border Protection, which includes the Border Patrol. Interior enforcement, as here in Chicago, was turned over to ICE, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So right now we spend $25 billion a year on immigration enforcement activity. We have 22,000 Border Patrol agents. We have 8,000 ICE immigration agents. We set a record back in 2013. Well, let me back up. We saw record high levels of deportations under the Obama administration, which deported 2.8 million people. We also saw record levels of criminal prosecutions for unauthorized entry and unauthorized reentry, which is a criminal offense. But these offenses became among the top prosecuted offenses within the federal criminal justice system. Though over the last couple of years, those numbers have leveled off somewhat. And we also saw greater engagement of law enforcement, local policing in immigration enforcement through data sharing programs like the Secure Communities program, which bootstrap certain information that local police departments send to the FBI for fingerprinting and such. So all of these steps that I've mentioned did not even count what happened during the previous presidential administration, which took advantage of many of the existing laws and put them into overdrive. And this included many of the provisions in the 1996 immigration law. So you saw things like travel bans. You saw extreme vetting of refugees and visa applicants. You saw major reductions in refugee resettlements to record low levels. You saw attempts to end the DACA program and to phase out the temporary protected status for immigrants from certain countries that were certain countries that were too dangerous to deport people back to. You saw again major efforts to crack down on the border, whether it was through family separation or the migrant protection protocols, or more recently, the use of Title 42, the pandemic-related provisions, to essentially turn people away, including many people who are seeking refuge and seeking asylum. You saw, major, significant changes to the immigration court procedures that resulted in vastly increased backlogs. And you saw other attempts to intimidate immigrants from participating in U.S. society, whether it was through the citizenship questions of the census, which ultimately was not included, higher applications fees for citizenship and other benefits, tougher citizenship tests, and toughened standards for public charge, which you'll recall was a basis for turning people away or denying people green cards based on suspicion that these individuals would end up relying on government support for their livelihood. Now, during the last year or so, President Biden has undone many of these changes, or tried to, but unfortunately, some of the broader goals that he came in pledging to try to, try to fix have gone undone. Most prominently, his promises to enact a broad legalization program for many of the undocumented people still in the United States. Congress attempted to do this through the Build Back Better bill. Unfortunately, Build Back Better ended up being shelved toward the end of last year, and it's not really clear what the prospects are, especially with Congress being so divided. I want to close here by noting that despite what's been happening on the federal level, the state of Illinois has been able, has been able to enact quite a number of provisions that welcome immigrants and that offer broader protections for immigrants. Over the last 20 years, we've expanded educational opportunities for undocumented students, including 3 years ago enacting legislation making undocumented students eligible for MAP grants and other state-level financial aid. In 2013, we passed legislation to allow undocumented immigrants to get driver's licenses. We've created programs to assist immigrants in applying for citizenship, and more recently, DACA. We have extended healthcare coverage to undocumented children and undocumented seniors. We now also provide direct cash assistance for many immigrant families who unfortunately were left out of federal COVID relief programs that were created over the past couple of years. And then most recently, just this past year, we were able to pass significant legislation that limits police cooperation with ICE, so that immigrants no longer need to fear, if they interact with or even cooperate with local police, that they will be turned over to ICE or reported to ICE, or they're now able to live more comfortable, safer lives in this state. So I'm coming up on the hour here, and I'll stop there, and hopefully we'll have a bit of time for questions, or any kind of discussion that you all may want to have. So thank you again.
Thank you, Fred, and at least encouraging, while we wait to see what happens in terms of creating more pathways to citizenship and to documented status, to see that in Illinois,
Mm-hmm.
there have been many advancements in the protection of immigrants in our communities.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see any questions that have been posted yet. If anyone would like to post a question or enter your chat, whether you're viewing us through Facebook or through YouTube, you could go ahead and do that now. I do realize it is 8 o'clock, but I don't see any questions coming in. If anyone would like more information, we did post there's the ICIR website, ICIRR.org for the Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights. Also, if you're interested in volunteering or getting more information about services that are available, please feel free to visit the site, or also you can contact us. And so it doesn't seem like we have any questions, Fred.
Okay.
But, thank you very much for joining us and for this program. And definitely a lot to unpack. Okay, and thank you. My colleague did post the ICIR website here on our social media in case anyone would like to explore that later or view your presentation at a later time.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you again, Mary Carmen, and thanks everyone for tuning in. And again, I hope you found this informative.
Thank you. And somebody just posted that it says thank you. Also, thank you for all the information. I really enjoyed. Okay. So thank you for letting us know. Cool. I hope everyone has a good night.
Okay.
So take care and thank you.
Thanks, everyone.